I thought I was just going to a family dinner, but by the end of the night, I learned a lesson I'll never forget, and so did my son and his wife. But when the doorbell rang, everything changed. Want to know what turned the whole evening upside down? Keep watching! It all started with a phone call from my son, Mark. "Mom, why don't you come over for dinner? Lisa's making something special." Now, I don't know about you, but when your grown kids invite you over, you drop everything, even your favorite episode of Jeopardy! I was halfway through shouting out, "What is the Louisiana Purchase?" when Mark's voice came through the line, and suddenly the TV didn't matter. There's something about your child's voice, even when they're all grown up, that tugs at your heartstrings and makes you want to be there for every little moment, even if it's just a Tuesday night dinner. I hung up the phone and immediately started fussing over what to wear. I know. He's seen me in my bathrobe and curlers more times than I can count. But there's something about going to your son's house for dinner that makes you want to look your best. I picked out my favorite blue blouse, the one with the little pearl buttons, and spritzed on a bit of the perfume I save for special occasions. I even put on a touch of lipstick, though I knew it would probably end up on my water glass before the night was over. Old habits die hard, and of course, I couldn't show up empty-handed. That's just not how I was raised. So I pulled out my trusty pie dish and got to work on an apple pie. The kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and sugar, and for a moment I was transported back to when Mark was a little boy, tugging at my apron strings and begging for a taste of the filling. I wrapped the pie in a clean towel, tucked it into my tote bag, and headed out the door, feeling a little flutter of excitement. Maybe tonight would be one of those rare, perfect family evenings you remember for years. But the moment I walked in, I felt it. You know that chill in the air when you realize you're not exactly the guest of honor? The kind that makes you wonder if you've shown up to the wrong party, or maybe the wrong decade. Lisa barely looked up from her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as if she was solving world peace, one text at a time. The grandkids were sprawled on the couch, eyes glued to their tablets, thumbs tapping away at some game I couldn't begin to understand. I stood in the entryway for a moment, pie in hand, waiting for someone to notice me. Mark finally glanced up from the dining room, where he was setting the table, and said, "Hey, Mom," before turning back to his stack of plates. No hug, no, "So glad you're here." Just a quick nod, as if I was the mail carrier dropping off a package. I'll admit, for a split second, I considered turning right around and heading home. I could have been back in my own kitchen, feet up, watching Alex Trebek and eating a slice of pie all by myself. But then I caught a whiff of something buttery and rich coming from the kitchen, and my curiosity got the better of me. What was Lisa making that was so special anyway? I set the pie down on the counter and tried to make small talk. "Hi, Lisa. That smells wonderful. Can I help with anything?" She didn't even look up, just mumbled, "No, we're good," and went back to her phone. I glanced at the grandkids, hoping for a smile or a, "Hi, Grandma." But they were lost in their digital worlds, headphones on, oblivious to everything but the next level of whatever game they were playing. I wandered into the dining room, where Mark was fussing with the silverware. "Need a hand?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He shook his head, barely meeting my eyes. "No, Lisa's got it all under control." "Just relax, Mom. Relax." Easier said than done when you feel like a piece of furniture that's been moved out of the way for a new rug. I sat down on the edge of the sofa, hands folded in my lap, and tried to remind myself that families go through phases. Maybe they were just having a rough day. Maybe Lisa was stressed about dinner. Maybe the grandkids would look up eventually and remember that Grandma always has a stick of gum in her purse. But as the minutes ticked by, the feeling of being an outsider only grew stronger. I watched as Lisa and Mark whispered in the kitchen, glancing over at me now and then. The kids laughed at something on their screens, completely disconnected from the world around them. I thought about all the dinners I'd hosted over the years, the way I'd fussed over every detail to make sure everyone felt welcome and loved. Was it too much to hope for a little of that in return? Still, I stayed. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was hope. Hope that the evening would turn around, that the chill in the air would melt away, and that I'd find my place at the table once again. After all, isn't that what we all want? A seat at the table, a warm welcome, and a little slice of home, even if it comes with a side of awkward silence. As I sat there, pie cooling on the counter and the smell of butter wafting through the house. I couldn't help but wonder, was this just a bad night, or was something deeper going on? And more importantly, was I ready to find out? Dinner was served, and by served, I mean Lisa and her family sat down to a feast that would make any seafood lover weak in the knees. The table was set with gleaming white plates, silver utensils, and cloth napkins folded into little fans, fancier than any dinner I'd ever hosted, that's for sure. In the center, a mountain of bright red lobsters steamed, their shells glistening under the chandelier. Bowls of drawn butter, lemon wedges, and little dishes of coleslaw and potato salad surrounded the main attraction. The aroma was heavenly, and I'll admit my stomach gave a hopeful little rumble. I hadn't eaten much all day, saving room for this special dinner Lisa had promised. I watched as she placed a lobster in front of Mark, then one for each of the kids, their faces lighting up as they reached for the claws and tails. Lisa took her seat at the head of the table, her own plate piled high, and for a moment I felt a flicker of anticipation. Maybe she'd just been distracted earlier. Maybe this was her way of making up for the chilly welcome. But as I reached for a plate, ready to join in the feast, Lisa slid a glass of water toward me. Just water. No ice, no lemon, nothing, and said, "We don't serve extra food." I blinked, thinking I must have misheard her. Surely she was joking. But her face was stone-cold serious, her eyes fixed on me as if daring me to protest. I glanced at Mark, expecting him to laugh it off, to say, "Oh, come on, Lisa, don't be ridiculous. Of course Mom gets dinner." But he just shrugged, not meeting my gaze, and muttered, "You should know your place." "Mom," the words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, and for a moment I felt like I'd been slapped. My cheeks burned, not from embarrassment, but from a mix of shock and hurt. I looked around the table, hoping for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding, but the kids were already cracking lobster shells, dipping the sweet meat into butter, oblivious to the tension swirling around them. Now, let me ask you, have you ever wanted to crawl under the table and disappear? Or maybe, just for a split second, throw a lobster claw at someone's head? I sat there, hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my composure. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. Was this some kind of punishment? Had I done something to offend Lisa? Was Mark really going to let this happen? I thought about all the times I'd welcomed them into my home, always making sure there was enough food for everyone, always saving the best piece of pie for Mark, always making the grandkids' favorite mac and cheese. And here I was, a guest in their home, being told I wasn't welcome at their table. I took a deep breath, willing myself not to cry. I could feel the sting behind my eyes, but I refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead, I smiled, one of those tight, polite smiles you give when you're trying not to lose your cool, and said, "Noted. Because sometimes, ladies, the best revenge is served cold. Or, in my case, with a side of patience." I sipped my water, watching as the family dug into their meal, the sound of cracking shells and laughter filling the room. Lisa chatted about her day at work. Mark chimed in with a story about the neighbor's new car, and the kids argued over who got the biggest claw. It was as if I wasn't even there, as if I'd become invisible the moment I walked through the door. I tried to distract myself by looking around the room. The dining table was new, a sleek modern thing with matching chairs. Nothing like the old oak table Mark had grown up with, the one covered in scratches and memories. The walls were decorated with family photos, but none of me. I spotted a picture of Mark and Lisa on their wedding day, the kids at Disney World, even the family dog dressed as a pumpkin for Halloween. But not a single photo of me, not even from the holidays I'd hosted, the birthdays I'd baked cakes for, the graduations I'd cheered at. I felt a pang of sadness, realizing just how far I'd drifted from the center of their lives, but I refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, I focused on the little things, the way the butter glistened in the candlelight, the sound of the kids' laughter, the memory of Mark as a boy, his face smeared with chocolate cake. I reminded myself that I was still me, no matter how they treated me tonight. I had my own stories, my own friends, my own life outside these four walls, and if they couldn't see my worth, well, that was their loss. As the meal wound down, Lisa finally glanced my way, her expression unreadable. "Would you like some dessert, Mom?" she asked, her tone flat. I shook my head, still smiling. "No, thank you. I brought a pie, but I think I'll save it for later." I stood up, smoothing my blouse, and gathered my things. Mark barely looked up, too busy helping the kids with their lobster crackers. I walked to the door, pie in hand, and paused for a moment, taking one last look at the family I'd once been the center of. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe I didn't belong at their table anymore, but I still belonged to myself, and sometimes that's enough. I walked to my car, head held high, already planning what I'd do with that pie when I got home. Maybe I'd invite a friend over, or maybe I'd just enjoy a big slice all by myself, savoring every bite. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't control how others treat you, but you can always choose how you respond. And tonight, I chose dignity, grace, and a little bit of sweet, sweet revenge. Just when I thought things couldn't get any more awkward, the doorbell rang, slicing through the thick silence that had settled over the table. I glanced up, half expecting another neighbor or maybe a delivery gone to the wrong address, but instead, in walked a man in a crisp white jacket, his chef's hat tucked under one arm and a leather satchel in the other. He looked every bit the part of a television chef, tall, confident, with a twinkle in his eye and a smile that could melt butter faster than the lobster on the table. Lisa stood up so quickly her chair nearly toppled over, smoothing her hair and putting on her best hostess face. "Chef Antonio, you're right on time," she said, her voice suddenly syrupy sweet. The kids perked up, whispering to each other, and Mark tried to look casual, but I could see the nerves in the way he fiddled with his napkin. Chef Antonio scanned the room, his eyes moving from Lisa to Mark to the kids, and then, suddenly, he saw me. His face lit up with recognition, and before I could even process what was happening, he strode over and took my hands in his. "Mrs. Thompson, what a surprise. I didn't know you'd be here. I owe you everything. Remember when you taught me to make apple pie at the community center?" His voice was warm and genuine, and for a moment the years melted away. I remembered Antonio as a shy young man, barely out of high school, who'd wandered into my baking class looking for a way to impress his grandmother. He'd been all thumbs with the rolling pin, but he'd had a heart of gold and a hunger to learn. I'd shown him how to make a proper pie crust, and he'd stayed after class to ask questions, always eager, always grateful. Now, here he was, a full-fledged chef, standing in my son's dining room, looking at me like I was the guest of honor. Lisa's jaw dropped, her eyes darting between us as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Mark looked like he'd swallowed a shell, his face turning a shade paler than the tablecloth. The kids, sensing the shift in the room, finally put down their tablets and watched with wide eyes. For the first time all evening I felt seen, not as an afterthought, not as a burden, but as someone who mattered. Chef Antonio turned to Lisa, his tone polite but firm. "I hope you don't mind, but I'd love to have Mrs. Thompson join me in the kitchen. She's the reason I became a chef, you know." Lisa, caught off guard, could only nod, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Mark mumbled something about sure, whatever, and the kids just stared, clearly impressed that their grandma was on a first-name basis with a real chef. In the kitchen, Antonio set to work with the kind of energy and joy that only comes from doing what you love. He handed me an apron. "Just like old times, Mrs. T." And together we got to work. He showed me the fresh lobsters he'd brought, explaining how he'd sourced them from a local fisherman that morning. "Only the best for you," he said with a wink. He melted butter in a pan, adding a splash of white wine and a sprinkle of fresh herbs, the aroma filling the kitchen and making my mouth water all over again. As we cooked, he told me about his journey, culinary school, working in restaurants, finally opening his own little bistro downtown. "But I never forgot your apple pie," he said, his eyes shining. "It's still the most popular dessert on my menu." While we worked, I could feel the tension from the dining room seeping away, replaced by a sense of pride and belonging I hadn't felt in years. Antonio plated up a beautiful lobster tail, drizzled with extra butter, just the way I like it, and garnished it with a sprig of parsley. "For you, Mrs. Thompson," he said, presenting it with a flourish. He insisted I sit at the kitchen island, and as I took my first bite, I swear I could taste every bit of kindness and gratitude he'd poured into the dish. The lobster was tender, the butter rich and fragrant, and for a moment, I forgot all about the awkwardness and hurt from earlier. But the real surprise came when Antonio called the family into the kitchen. "Come see what your mom and I made," he announced, his voice booming with pride. Lisa and Mark shuffled in, the kids trailing behind, curiosity written all over their faces. Antonio explained how I'd taught him to cook, how I'd inspired him to follow his dreams, and how tonight he wanted to honor me with a special dish. The kids looked at me with newfound respect, and even Lisa seemed at a loss for words. Mark finally managed a weak smile, mumbling, "Wow, Mom, I didn't know." I just smiled, savoring the moment. I took another bite of lobster, letting the buttery goodness linger on my tongue. Revenge, as it turns out, really is best served with a side of patience, and maybe a little extra butter. The whole family watched as I enjoyed every bite, and for the first time that night, I felt truly at home. Not because of the food or the fancy chef, but because I remembered who I was, and reminded them too. As the evening wound down, Antonio packed up his things, giving me a warm hug before he left. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, for everything." I watched him go, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. Sometimes life has a funny way of bringing things full circle, and sometimes the sweetest victories come when you least expect them. By dessert, the mood in the house had shifted so completely you'd think someone had opened a window and let in a fresh breeze. The tension that had hung over dinner like a heavy curtain was gone, replaced by a strange, almost awkward sense of curiosity and, dare I say, respect. Lisa, who had spent most of the evening glued to her phone or shooting me icy glances, suddenly seemed eager to make small talk. She asked about my old baking classes at the community center, about the apple pie recipe Chef Antonio had raved about, and even about my plans for the holidays. Her voice was a little too bright, her smile a little too forced, but I could tell she was trying. I suppose it's hard to ignore someone after a professional chef walks into your home and credits them for his entire career. Funny how quickly people can change their tune when the spotlight shifts. Mark, for his part, seemed sheepish. He kept glancing at me as if searching for the right words, but mostly he just busied himself clearing plates and refilling water glasses. When he finally offered me a slice of pie, my own pie, the one I'd brought from home and that had sat untouched on the counter all evening, I couldn't help but smile. "Thank you, but I'm full," I said, my voice gentle but firm. I watched his face fall just a little, and I hoped he understood that I wasn't being petty. I was simply done begging for a seat at a table where I wasn't wanted. Sometimes you have to draw a line, even with your own children. The grandkids, who had barely looked up from their screens all night, suddenly seemed interested in me for the first time. "Grandma, how do you know Chef Antonio?" the oldest asked, her eyes wide with wonder. I told them about the baking classes, about how Antonio had been a student of mine, and how he'd worked so hard to become the chef he was today. Their faces lit up with surprise and, I think, a little pride. For a moment, I saw a glimmer of the connection I'd always hoped to have with them. A shared story, a bit of family history, something to hold on to. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the start of something new. As the evening wound down, Lisa tried to salvage what was left of her hostess duties. She offered coffee, tea, even a second helping of dessert, but I politely declined. I could see the effort in her eyes, the way she was trying to patch over the awkwardness of the evening, but I wasn't interested in pretending everything was fine. I'd spent too many years smoothing things over, making myself small so others could feel big. Tonight, I realized, I didn't have to do that anymore. Mark walked me to the door, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Mom, I'm sorry about earlier," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the little boy he used to be, the one who used to run to me with scraped knees and big dreams. "Thank you, Mark," I said softly. "I hope you remember tonight, not just the food, but what it means to treat people with kindness." He nodded. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe he understood. I stepped out into the cool night air, the pie still tucked under my arm, and took a deep breath. The stars were out, bright and clear, and I felt lighter than I had in years. As I walked to my car, I thought about everything that had happened, the hurt, The humiliation, the unexpected reunion with Antonio, and the way the tables had turned, quite literally, by the end of the night. I realized something important. Sometimes knowing your place doesn't mean accepting less. It means knowing your worth, standing tall, and refusing to let anyone make you feel small. It means recognizing that you have value, that your kindness and your stories matter, even if others forget for a while. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the universe sends a chef or a friend or a stranger, or even a memory, to remind everyone else too. I smiled to myself, thinking about Antonio's words, about the pride in his eyes when he talked about the apple pie I'd taught him to make. I thought about the grandkids' questions, the way their faces had lit up when they realized their grandma was someone special. I thought about Mark's apology and Lisa's awkward attempts at conversation, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me. When I got home, I set the pie on the kitchen counter and made myself a cup of tea. I sat at my own table, the one covered in scratches and memories, and savored a big slice of pie. Still warm, still sweet, still mine. I thought about calling a friend, maybe inviting her over for a late-night treat. But for now, I was content to sit in the quiet, grateful for the lessons of the evening. Because here's the thing, ladies, life has a way of surprising us, of turning the tables when we least expect it. Sometimes the people who overlook us the most are the ones who need us the most. And sometimes the best thing we can do is simply know our worth. Hold our heads high and let the world catch up. So, if you've ever felt invisible, or unappreciated, or just plain left out, remember this: you are enough. You always have been, and sometimes all it takes is a little twist of fate and maybe a chef in a white jacket to remind everyone else. So, ladies, have you ever had a dinner disaster turn into a delicious victory? Drop your stories in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And if you enjoyed this tale of family, food, and a little bit of karma, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that'll make you laugh, cry, and maybe even crave lobster. Until next time, keep smiling and always save room for dessert.